Welcome everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Lea Niccolai, who is an assistant professor in classics at the Trinity College of Cambridge. She studied classics at the Scuola Normale Superiore and completed a second MA in ancient Near Eastern studies at the University of Pisa. She obtained her PhD in ancient history from King's College, Cambridge, in 2020, with a thesis entitled Age of Philosophy, the Self-Presentation of Power in the Post-Constantine Empire. Afterward, she has been a research fellow and a teaching associate in ancient history in Cambridge. And her research investigates mainly how culture, and especially Neoplatonism, promoted socio-political changes in the later Roman Empire. But her research interests are broad and include, for instance, also theories of ignorance, ancient theories of the mind, connections between rhetoric and religion, and so on. Among her publications, I would like to mention her 2023 monograph, Christianity, Philosophy, and Roman Power, Constantine, Julian, and the Bishops and the Exegetics and Empire, and her 2019 article, From Epic to Parable, a Syriac reading of the Fall of Troy in the museum. Today, Lea will present a paper entitled Who Needs Words? Philo of Alexandria on the writtenness of the scripture. Lea, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Georgia, for this beautiful introduction, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to this hugely stimulating seminar. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share for the first time, in a sense, my new directions of research. As Georgia, you said, I'm a late antique historian, but now I'm trying to move back a bit to a previous interest of mine. It was Hellenistic Judaism, and so we'll be talking about Philo of Alexandria. And I'm also, I should briefly say, delighted to see more friendly faces in the audience than what I was expecting, including some I haven't seen in a few years. So hello to everyone, and I will now share a PowerPoint, if that is fine. So I can send request. I think I might have to be.
Perhaps just try to share it as it is rather than requesting the host.
Yes, now it's fine. It was it said something. So
perfect.
And I will close this one. Yeah. Very well. So let me begin with a warming up question, which is also my most pressing research question at the moment. Do you need to be a good, this doesn't, do you need to be a good reader of literature, of texts, in order to understand nature, life, the universe itself? It might seem unlikely, or at least debatable. However, if you understand nature, life, and the universe as enlivened by the same divine reason, which is revealed by inspired writings, then the answer to my initial question must be affirmative, at least for ancient thinkers. Scholars easily acknowledge how Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic philosophers worked around an increasingly crystallizing canon, which led the philosophical communities to regard exegesis more and more as constitutive of what philosophy is, so as a crucial aspect of philosophical practice of contemplation. We tend to linger less, however, on how imperial exegetes offered their readings of Plato, Homer, or the Bible as lessons on interpretation tout court. So as something illustrating how to decode correctly what, although not put in writing, is as revealing as writing, say the Bible, of the divine design. In this case, reality, history, and all the other unwritten things I was mentioning before, nature, life, the universe itself. What I've become increasingly interested in is the idea that the relationship of ancient exegetes with texts was often offered and conceptualized as a preparation to transcending the texts and address the unuttered and the unutterable. So with a corresponding irony whereby you showcase as an exegete your mastery of texts to signify your understanding of everything else. This reflection, as I was saying at the start, has taken me back from late antiquity to the 1st century CE and Philo of Alexandria, the key representative of Jewish Platonism, we might call it Jewish Platonism, the exegete and the politician. I regard Philo as pivotal to the story I'm trying to outline. First, because Philo was one of the most creative and influential ancient theorists of an interpretive methodology drawing on Greek philosophy to illuminate the Hebrew Bible and the other way around, with the end in sight of explaining the created universe. And secondly, Philo was crucially in conversation with a Greco-Roman imperial audience, a wide Greco-Roman imperial audience, as discussed in seminal scholarship. I'm thinking here, for instance, of Mare Niehoff's many writings on the subject. And this also explains why his methodology would then be later lifted up and seamlessly woven in early Christian exegesis. Philo, lastly, and this is my main point, especially raises an issue that lies at the heart of authoritative interpretation, the question of how to read law. He lived in a world in which human laws, Roman laws, Egyptian laws, are written, enacted, and interpreted. But it was also a world intensely reflecting on the nature of divine law in its life-informing authority. In an article that has been my inspiration for this research, Najman outlines the paradoxicality of Philo's notion of law. Philo is fully cognizant of the Stoic and Platonist argument that any written law code is contingent and therefore imperfect, because the universal law of God, be it logos, fate, nature, transcends the written laws of any human polis. And yet, at the same time, Philo does postulate the law of Moses as divine law, even if it is written. As a Greek-speaking Jew brought up on the Septuagint, Philo calls the set of books comprising Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy as nomos, as law, rather than its Hebrew equivalent Torah, with its more encompassing meaning of teaching from yara, instruction, doctrine, and so on. Moses is therefore the lawgiver, and Philo eloquently posits the unique status of the law of Moses in the life of Moses as a written copy of the law of nature. This passage is often cited, in which he says that the law of Moses is stamped with the seals of nature herself. The tension of the contingency of Moses' written law and its universality as divine law is one that, as Najman shows, remains unsolved. It must remain unsolved. But what I would like to do now is to build on this premise, to discuss how Philo himself exposes and explores the tension between written and unwritten law. And what emerges from this exposure is a methodological statement targeting the Hellenistic-minded audiences of Philo as to how the law of Moses is the text that always contains more than itself. A text that teaches, by means of words, how to overcome its own written form. So far on my, say, overall agenda for this talk, which will be composed of two short parts. First, I will focus on how Philo, first through the narrative of the life of the lawmaker of Moses, acknowledges the ultimate coincidence of the word of God with the language of nature, and thus presents the lawmaker as someone who both writes and lives the law. The law of Moses, however, continues to exist in a written form, and why that should be the case will be in part 2, the point of my reading of a specific treatise on the migration of Abraham as Philo's exegetical statement on this matter. So, on the idea of the law of God as coextensive with nature and therefore as transcending the real. The understanding that divine logos informs and structures nature returns across various Philonic treatises, but it is interesting to take as a starting point the life of Moses, because, as I was saying earlier, it is the text that narrativizes Moses' act of putting God's law into words. A first point of interest is how the book emphasizes the transcendence of God's communication. Esoukia, which means silence, stillness, is the key word in Philo's retelling of the account of the burning bush in Exodus. This is God's first manifestation to Moses, and Philo takes the idea that the burning bush is a visual event in Icon, which heralds future, which a silence that speaks more clearly than speech. I think I might have forgotten to put this passage in the PowerPoint, yes, but essentially it is what Philo says. In the corresponding passage in Exodus, narrating the story, God himself confronts the limits of language because he provides his famous definition, self-definition here on the slides, which is a definition which eludes itself. So in Exodus 3:14, he famously says this, I am who I am, as it is translated in English. So, ye asher ye, ego eimi oon in the Greek rendering. In the life of Moses, in Philo's life of Moses, this brief but very poignant statement becomes for Philo the opportunity to formulate a proper statement of negative theology, of apophatic theology, where he says, God replied, first tell them that I am he who is, that they may learn the difference between what is and what is not. And also the further lesson that no name at all can properly be used of me, to whom alone existence belongs. So he's really expanding on it. Philo captures here Exodus as a book uniquely confronting God's reckoning with the limits of language by providing both a condensed lecture on ontology and a reminder that words and names cannot capture God in his unknowability. God offers and denies to Moses the possibility of being known in words. Another way in which Philo seems to be working to capture how God's communication transcends the verbal is in his account of the Exodus plagues. In the biblical account, God is portrayed as speaking to Moses and describing the plague that is about to happen, as you can see here in the text. In Philo's version of the story, conversely, it is only the narrator, so Philo himself, who tells us every time what is happening and why. So God's speeches, verbal speeches, are elided, and he is silent, except that he is not. Because crucially, God makes himself understandable here by acting through the rules of nature that are themselves the expressions of his providence. Philo rationalizes the plagues, which he describes as scientific events. His account is capped by a brief explanation of the correlation between the plagues and the elements of the cosmos. So the sequence of the plagues is scrambled in the text, and in this way it aligns better with Philo's physicist reading. Afterwards, he lingers systematically for every plague on how he understands the natural mechanisms by means of which the prodigies unfold. Here there is the passage on the locusts is remarkable in this sense, but it's also very long. So I might skip it for now and just show you what he does instead with the episode of the plague of the boils in Exodus 9:10. I have highlighted here in the expansion in the Vita Moses all the Greek word that Philos uses, which are lifted up from the Corpus Hippocraticum, so showing how he's really trying to explain this by also positing himself as a scientific, as a medical interpreter of the plague. Sorry, I've lost my thread. By replacing God's speeches with Philo's exegesis of the forces of a sympathetic cosmos, Philo is presenting himself as a competent reader of natural law. He uses many words, many more than Exodus actually, to explain how God's communication transcends its verbal formulation, being coextensive with the living cosmos. Inevitably, another paradox emerges, whereby Philo must insist on the rules of nature precisely when he is describing nature's upheaval. From this articulation of divine law as informing life derives finally his argument that the lawgiver not only writes but lives the law. Moses is eloquently defined here and elsewhere in the text as embodied and souled law, which is a concept of long-lasting, extremely long-lasting importance throughout imperial kingship theory up to deep late antiquity. Now, this specific point is one on which there has been already a lot of scholarly discussion, so I will leave it on the side for now, but just presenting it in case you might want to return to it in the discussion. Including Philo's description of the other patriarchs, for instance, Abraham, as other instantiations of this possibility of leaving the law before it is even written. So having said this, on the ultimate embodiment of divine law because of its natural manifestation, I will move on now to the second part of my talk and my key argument. So on the migration of Abraham. What I would like to deal with now is the problem of the, so to speak, of the textual leftover. Written divine law informs exemplary lives and resolves in life itself, but it is ultimately still there. It is still written. So how to make sense of its persistent embeddedness in infinitude? I suggest that Philo's treatise on the migration of Abraham targets this point specifically, being also, among other things, a reflection on the limits and the necessity of writing, or better I should say, a reflection on the necessity of a form of writing that exists so as to confront its limits. In Migration, Philo comments on a very narrow section of Genesis. It's Genesis 12, 1 to 4, actually. Here I put only 1 and 3. In these lines, God commands Abraham to leave his country, his people, and his father's household. Philo allegorizes each of these injunctions and interprets these three items as respectively corresponding to leaving the body, leaving sense perception, and crucially, leaving speech. So when God orders that Abraham leaves his father's house, this is interpreted as the order that Abraham must leave speech itself. He must transcend it, abandoning the finitude of words. The rest of the treatise works to reconcile the divinity of the Pentateuch with the necessity of transcending the verbal by positing the law of Moses as the liminal space, where God's order to overcome language is articulated in language. The meaning of scripture is not bound to its literal articulation, but requires interpretation, it requires allegory. And this is not simply because the father's house means something else, that is speech. What I find interesting is that Philo here highlights how the Pentateuch itself is structured so that its parts signify something beyond themselves. There is an interconnectedness. In fact, the meaning of God's injunction as formulated in Genesis 12 is illuminated elsewhere, is illuminated in Exodus. Philo reads the entirety of Exodus as the allegory of leading out, of transcending, based on exagoge. He says, right, well then, did the sacred guide inscribe one entire sacred book of the law giving, exagoge or leading out, for the name thus found was appropriate to the oracles contained in it. He tends to speak of the divine word as oracle, chrismos, which is common at the time. And I forgot to say why I have chosen the fresco of the crossing of the synagogue, the Red Sea, sorry, from the synagogue of Dura Europos as the cover image for this talk, because this is to Philo the story that transcends itself. It's the narrative archetype postulating the necessity of overcoming the narrative. So on the one hand, exagoge is the book articulating the interpretive injunction. We should also remember that, as seen before, this is the book that captures God's own reckoning with the limits of language via his enigmatic self-definition. On the other hand, however, Philo also etymologizes on Abraham's self-identification as Hebraios in Genesis, and he presents it as deeply tied to and anticipating this notion of crossing over. Hebraios, he argues, means perates, the migrant from the house of the father, which is speech. So he says, he was proud to own himself a member of the Hebrew race, whose wont it is, as the name Hebrew wandering indicates, to quit the objects of sense perception and go after those of mind. He's here arguably working with the etymology of Ivri as related to avar, lavor, so to cross over. Philo captures thus Hebrew as the word capturing its limits as a word. Therefore, he makes of Hebraios the counterpart to exagoge as what captures the ideal interpreter of the text that asks to be read in such a way as to be transcended. The two terms are the two faces of the same coin, and this leads to my key point. By so doing, Philo makes of scriptural language a distinctive language that operates by working as a permanent reminder of our necessity to overcome it. The law of Moses is the text that teaches how it should be read as beyond itself, offering this reading to the perates, who is the individual who lives to cross over. Now, this educational function explains why the written divine word, while inviting its own overcoming, must remain written. Exodus is sacred writing that acknowledges the finitude of the words, but it is also, and crucially, the text providing the reason as to why speech is ultimately necessary. Philo interprets God's promise to Abraham that he will bless him, eulogezo in the Greek of the Septuagint, as the promise that he will give to him excellent logos, eulogeo. Third gift, he says, is blessing or excellence of reason and speech. And apart from this, it is not possible to make the former gracious gifts secure. He says, and I will bless thee, I will endow thee with excellent reason and speech. Afterwards, Philo continues to work with Exodus in the same text to exemplify, through Moses and Aaron's confrontation with the Egyptian magicians, the importance of this gift of eulogia. I considered before how in his account of the plagues of Egypt, Philo explains how God makes himself understandable by acting through the rules of nature that are themselves the expression of his providence. If we keep this in mind, it is illuminating to see how, in the treatment of the magicians in On the Migration, the magical tricks of the Egyptian magicians who try to counteract Moses and Aaron's actions are presented as imitating the divine prodigies, but are also compared to mere words. Words that imitate divine speech, but cannot do it. We return to the idea of the prodigies as God's unverbal speech that unfolds through nature. So the words of the magicians are not equally authorized. And Philo writes, you must have observed how the aim of those who use charms and enchantments, when they bring their trickery into play against the divine word and dare to attempt to do things like those which it does, is not so much to win honor for their own skill as to traduce and ridicule the miracles which are taking place. They transform the rods into real snakes and turn the water to the color of blood, and by incantations draw up to the land where frogs are still left. The magicians produce what shortly afterwards, this is paragraph 85, Philo defines as sophistikoi logos, logoi, so empty sophistical words. Again, he is speaking the language of the time, words that have no access to truth. It becomes therefore evident on this ground that God's gift of eulogia is needed in the world of contingency. Exodus narrates, via words demanding interpretation, how revealed word is necessary in a situated historical context in which there is the risk of being misled by any speech that is not reflexive of truth, that does not and cannot teach how to overcome itself. By arguing this, Philo captures the interaction between the text of the law and what is beyond it as necessary and vital, even in its paradoxicality. Actually, precisely in its paradoxicality. So, my conclusions. Philo of Alexandria exemplifies what I find is one critical feature of imperial exegetes, how the reading of authoritative texts prepares somewhat counterintuitively to interpret the unwritten, which is life, divinity, what lies beyond the writing or cannot be contained in writing. In the specific case I discussed, Philo is working to illustrate how the written law of Moses can speak for the divine natural law, despite its textual contingency. This tension between the written and the unwritten is explored by Philo On the Migration of Abraham, which individuates the law of Moses as a text that uniquely exists to point towards its own overcoming. At the same time, however, this gesturing, this teaching must be articulated in words, because it is only through words that it can enter the arena of non-divine speaking and direct humans to engage with those messages that educate on how to go beyond the speech. Thank you for your attention. Now, I will maybe stop the screen sharing now.
Thank you very much, Lea, for a wonderful presentation on an aspect of Philo that we hadn't heard before. We have time for questions, so I'd suggest if you do have them, you can raise your hand physically or digitally. I can check it. Or if you are not able to speak, you can also write your name, write your question in the chat. I would say your presentation has at least some things. I've had some inspirations, which it sounded familiar for me. I don't necessarily have a question, but many things sounded very familiar for me, and for maybe some people working with Ephraim of Nisibis in the 4th century, or there's some I'm seeing some similarities there, where it's very much also engaging with this idea that it's and raging against people who are trying to sort of grasp God in words, which is impossible. Of course, the only thing you can do is try and get as close as possible by interpreting the text that you have. So in this kind of sense, it's very similar. And also this tradition of Abraham crossing. I've seen it somewhere in Syriac text as well. So that's been very very similarities. I was just wondering, maybe in terms of, my question would be, well, it's maybe not necessarily directly relating to what you're speaking about, this issue of this natural and divine law. I guess and these laws, I guess it has to do with the idea that that through creation everything is, and nature would be have divine inspiration anyway. Is a sort of a reflection from the part of Philo about how should I put this? Divinity in all of us, I guess. Does he have these types of reflections? The divinity in the presence of divinity in the world.
Thank you very much. These are both, I would say, crucial questions. On the point of Ephraim and the presence of these themes in Syriac literature, in Syriac mystical literature, I would say that I have no doubt it is the case, and I would be very interested in following this on. I think, I mean, in a sense, I've come to researching Philo from this point of view, from this angle, precisely because I'm a late antique, I'm a scholar of late antique culture, and my area of specialization is the 4th century. So what I've done was essentially to trace back apophatic threads and apophatic trends, reflections on allegory, exegesis, mystical interpretation, and go back until I saw that, I mean, what I think here is that Philo is still quite unappreciated as the proper laboratory for as much as we can reconstruct of so much of this, which then will take on its life and a very dynamic spread. Also thanks to how Philo himself is absorbed and mobilized by Origen of Alexandria, or that tradition that just injects his allegorical thinking through the libraries into early Christian exegesis. So definitely at some point, I think these themes have their own diffraction, but Philo for me is in some senses a pioneer, and of course we do have the problem of his corpus surviving and much else not, but the extensiveness of his engagement, his intention to communicate with Greco-Roman audiences, also probably his position as one of the most prominent members of the Jewish community in Alexandria, as the leader of the embassy to Gaius and so on, made it especially visible socially and culturally. And so I hope this replied to the first question. The second one was on the tension between natural and divine law. Yes, I think this is something on which there is discussion to what extent then the embodiment of the law, the possibility of living in perfect harmony with the law itself, is a form of self-divinization, is a way of finding the divinity that for Platonic thinking is in us. For instance, especially when engaging with the treatise on the therapeutae, who have shaped this community of people who live according to the nature and the law. I don't have anything specific to contribute to the scholarship on this topic, except the idea that Philo is in conversation with that because that is part of his philosophical background, so he's aware of it. But at the same time, I think his sense of the distance of the human from God that comes from his engagement with the Bible also creates some tensions and some complications in this respect as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Georgia, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It was really fascinating, and thank you for driving us through this complexity of Philo's thought. And I think that, well, my question, every time I work, like I hear people working on Philo, I have questions that are a bit untangled. So I hope I will try to make myself clear. But it had to do with what you were saying, referring to the embodiment of divine law, and also the fact that also the audience for these treatises. So can you tell us a little bit more as to about who is Philo exactly writing to, and how, and if you can see a tension between the embodiment of divine law, the fact that Moses' law is somehow reflecting the laws of nature, but at the same time, Philo is living in Alexandria and is maybe writing for a Greco-Roman audience. Is there a way of putting everything together, or shall we just accept that there is some complexity there?
Yeah, there is absolutely a huge amount of complexity. Maybe let me take the question of the audience first. This is something that has been very much studied also in, especially by Mare Neophyte, as I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk, and in consideration of the levels of engagement of Philo of Alexandria with Greek philosophical culture. Some treatises seem to be engaging more explicitly or are more committed to a Stoic framework rather than a Platonic one. And this is something that is observed in particular in respect to the group of writings that is classified as the exposition of the law. And the Life of Moses is one of those. The allegorical commentary has slightly different features, but the thing is that Philo is an interlocutor with multiple environments. Certainly a constituency of Jewish Platonist commentators on the Bible in Alexandria himself. So he has he aligns with some on how much of Greek philosophy should be applied to these texts, how much they should be allegorized, how much the literal sense of the text should be taken at face value. This is another important point on the migration of Abraham that I've then cut off the paper. But he's also something that is recognized is that the treatises of the exposition of the law, so those that are more exoterical, more open to the public, seem to pattern to reshape the figures of the Bible, the patriarchs, the narratives in a way that. Sorry, I think there is the fire alarm going off. Okay, stop. These lives are patterned in some way, in such a way as to be appealing to the philosophical ideas of the Greco-Roman, Stoic and Platonic audiences. Also, I mean, we know that Philo was, as I was mentioning before, one of the leaders, the leader of this embassy to the Emperor Caligula in Rome. He spent some time in Rome. This might have contributed to his engagement with this philosophical trends, but he's talking in some treatises. He's very clearly talking I should say better. He's trying to present Judaism as some sort of universal religion that is compatible with the philosophical ideals of the universal empire. I mean, here I'm referring to the self-conceptualization of the Romans at the time. And in terms of, lastly, in terms of the embodiment, here there is a big problem in the sense that we do have this so-called Pythagorean treatises that are very influential in late antique political theory, kingship theory, and they make a huge deal about the idea that the ruler is nomos emsiokos, should be ensouled law, so that crops up in political debates in imperial times. But the thing is that the dating of those treatises is really it's a can of worms. So I think that so far there is no agreement or no exact way to pinpoint their origin and precise time frame.
Yeah, thank you. Can I pick up on one of the things that you said?
Of course, yes.
So you said that one of the threads there is how much should one allegorize?
Yeah.
So how much should one? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. No, of course. This is actually one of my current obsessions at the moment, which I'm very happy to share with you. So there is the problem of what the main problem is whether the literal meaning of the law of Moses should be elided, should be entirely overcome in interpretation. And this is something that Philo strongly resents, and on the migration of Abraham, he accuses those who say that the only meaning of the law of Moses is simply could say the spiritual one, if you want to draw on a later terminology, so that whatever is written in the text, be those, purity laws or circumcision or anything, it does and should not be followed in the literal sense. For Philo and for following commentators afterwards, including, among others, Julian the Emperor, which is that was my previous topic of research, is the reason why I still work on this. In fact, correct allegory is the form of interpretation that makes sense both of the literal meaning of the text and of the further spiritual significance that the text is gesturing towards. So those who elide the one aspect or the other do not understand how the sacred text is working. And for me, the question is, why it should be that? I think there is something that has to do with the idea that these texts work like nature because they too are created, and so also nature is always real, but a reminder of the real reminder of its own createdness that is divine, transcendent, because here we are dealing with a Platonic framework. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fascinating. Thanks.
Marion.
Thank you so much, Lea, for this rich talk. I wondered if laws are embodied in the lives of certain figures like Abraham, as you showed us, why why did Philo see it as necessary for the law to be written down as well? Does he reflect on that? I was curious if you could maybe say something about
Yes,
that.
yes. Thank you, Marian. There was this ties into my final point that so in a sense you had these ideal figures, Abraham, Isaac, and so on, who could embody the law before it was written, because they simply had to live according to nature. And in this way, they could enact the law through the law, their own life, because there was a perfect unity, let's say, between the two things. My impression is that here on the migration of Abraham, which is really about Genesis as pointing to Exodus, so it's really about Exodus, Philo is presenting Exodus as the work that explains to you that you need a written Bible, you need to write down the text of God, because you need it in order to deal with the intrusion of history and how in a historical contingent context you might have to deal with people who give confusing, sophistical messages that imitate the word of God, but are not quite that. So therefore I was focusing on Moses' confrontation with the Egyptian priests, because also the Egyptian priests are acting and therefore are speaking like God. And it is in this case, what I call as, the intrusion of history, the confrontation with the Egyptians, that you need something to counteract. So for as long as you live in a contingent world, the true written word of God works as your anchor, as what you can hold on to then climb up the hermeneutical exegetical ladder.
Thank you for this elaboration. Really interesting to see Exodus as so central.
Yeah, I was surprised myself. I mean, maybe I'm over-reading text.
Thank you.
Another question just popped into my mind, which is relating to sort of quote unquote apocryphal or pseudepigraphical books. How would that work? Does he talk about any, like for instance, Book of Jubilees or something like that? I don't think he talks about that, but does he reflect upon such text? Or I mean, obviously they're not canon, but would that count as something trying to mimic divine law, or how does that work in his sort of mindset, in his oeuvre?
Jubilees would be interesting. It is, I think it's part of this larger, it has been studied as part of this larger context of reflection on how to categorize the importance of the law, of the written law in a transforming world. So I think there's some scholarship on Hellenistic Judaism at large that engage more with the relationship between Jubilees and Philo, rather than, as you were saying, not with Philo's engagement with Jubilees themselves. Now, I should say I actually don't know, because the corpus of Philo is huge. I'm slowly munching my way through it. So on top of my mind, I can't think of anything that engages with this. But maybe in a month from now, in 10 years from now, we'll find something that we find a positive reply. I wonder if anybody in the audience actually has thoughts on this, and in that case, please do jump in.
Please do. Anyone have any other questions or remarks about this or about anything else? Now is your opportunity. Yes, Timothy, go ahead.
Thanks, Lea, so much for this this talk. This was really really interesting. And then not picking up on Andy's question about non-canonical text, but I mean just kind of this relation of the written law and the natural law, and then also kind of divine speech being recast was really interesting, and I think something that's been recognized, but it's nice to hear it fleshed out. And I got to thinking when you were getting very specific about, for example, the use of vocabulary. I think it was in the plague on the boils, talking about from the Corpus Hippocraticum. when we see this kind of, I mean, I think in Philo, of course, we see these concepts being used broadly, but how specific do we get in any of these passages of Philo? And I must plead ignorance. I've not analyzed any of Philo's texts in enough detail to see this, but I mean, can we look and say, oh, not only is he drawing very closely, because it looked like the examples you gave were pretty densely packed into one passage. Are these still also kind of broad concepts, or are we even in a position in some passages of Philo to say, clearly he's using this particular portion of this known text? I'm just kind of curious about how broad or how narrowly we can think about his background, his influence.
Thank you, Timothy. And by the way, very good to see you, although on Zoom. Yes, so there has been scholarship also on this, of course. The passage on the of the retelling of the plagues is very extended, and Philo retells everything. In some parts, he's more narrative. In others, he's more scientific, as I was trying to say. But so if I understand correctly your question, we can trace some of the sources. There is some tracing of the sources which I haven't redone myself. So it could be that there is even more. And that is not unique to the text of the life of Moses, because in other writings, like for instance, I'm thinking of the De Opificio Mundi as the one that is most invested in the idea of the creation. There, Philo is really bringing in a lot of stuff to theorize philosophically, I mean, through the Greek philosophical lens, how the world is created in Genesis. And I would say there, though, the sources is not as quite scientific as it is philosophical, numerological, and provided that often in his thinking, these things merge with one another. So there is a constant blurring of the boundaries of what counts as mathematics, and how from mathematics you move seamlessly through the mystical Pythagorean meaning of numbers, and from there to Platonic projections of the levels of the universe. I hope this was a reply.
There is a question of Judith in the chat. She's not able to speak, so I'm just going to read it out, and then it's about relating to the issue of audience. Even though it is speculative, how would this audience have reacted to the idea that Jewish divine law is written but surpassing its verbal form in comparison or contrast to Greek or Roman law, which in some form also has a divine inspiration as part of its formation process? Is Philo making a more political statement via his philosophy? Is it not only compatible with Roman philosophy of the time, but also surpassing Roman law then?
It's I mean, thank you to Judith for this question. Is another of the things I'm working on at the moment, because I think this is precisely what it is at stake in his work, the conversation of Roman law with Greek philosophical notions of nomos and the law of Moses. These three things are in a constant triangulation in Philo's thinking. And I think what he's trying to do here is to engage with the question by drawing on arguments and terms that would have appealed to the Greco-Roman audience. So he's trying his best to present the argument for the universality of Moses' law in a way that he hopes will work for them, will be persuasive and not just an apodictic statement. That's the way I take it. Another text that I was using to reflect precisely on this question now is the treatise that survives only in Armenian. So unfortunately, I have to work with the translation that deals with animal rationality. because there the polemical target, I mean, it's somewhat counterintuitive, but the polemical target is Philo's famous apostate nephew, Tiberius Julius Alexander, who went on to do an extraordinary political career in the Roman administration. And he was committed, according to the treatise, to Platonic philosophy and the idea that animals have full rationality, partake in rationality. So what happens in the treatise is that Philo seeks to refute Tiberius Julius Alexander, and he tells him that he doesn't understand law, and therefore he doesn't understand the community. Now I'm wildly paraphrasing. He's treating him as a bad politician by virtue of how he doesn't understand how animals and humans should be separated in, they do not build the same community. And then he uses this refutation to show how the Bible and Stoic beliefs, so what would have been appreciated by the Roman intelligentsia, are in harmony, are in unison on this point. So I think that there he's doing two things. He's showing that the Bible works well with the Roman thinking, and the second point is that it works well with Roman thinking in terms of community building, which is as closest as possible to the idea of how you make the law work in real life, if this makes sense. Thanks to you, I see the reply.
There you go. Okay, are there any more questions? Your last chance? No. Okay, thank you. So that leaves for us to thank Lea Niccolai for a wonderful paper. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you next time. Have a great day.
Thank
Thanks to
you.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
See you in 2 weeks.
Good seeing you all.
Ooh.